It really is a pleasure to have Stephen L. Carter here tonight. I went back through our archives of our events, and I discovered that if I counted correctly, this is the 8th time you've been at Politics and Prose. The first time was back in 1993. We're so honored to have him here again. We hope you'll keep coming back. I think you might be creeping up on the record for the store, so you got to keep producing these books. But obviously, if he's been here that many times, you know how prolific this gentleman is, and that is with writing fiction not even being his day job. He is a distinguished professor at Yale Law School. He's written extensively about legal issues from intellectual property to ethics to religion. And in addition to his academic writing, he's also written 7 books, I think it's 7, of nonfiction. 8 books of nonfiction. I obviously did not major in math. And many, many commentaries in different publications and fora. Back Channel is, now I hope I get this right, his 4th novel. What's most, was that right? 6? How did we get all these? Okay, 6 plus. Okay. Anyway, it's a lot of books. The man has written many, many, many books. But I think in addition to the number of books, which in itself is impressive, especially while he's teaching law at Yale, they're all really good. So, that's pretty impressive. His novels have been described as historical fiction, and indeed they involve historical characters and events. But another description might be alternative or alternate history, a blending of fact and fiction that allow the readers to imagine or reimagine a world they think they already know, but to do so in new and evocative ways. His newest story, for those of you who've read this, you know this, but those who haven't yet, revolves around events in 1962 and the Bay of Pigs crisis that brought the Soviet Union and the United States to the brink of nuclear war. Now, we know, if we're a certain age, we know from our own lives, and if we're not of a certain age, we know from reading history who the main characters were at the time, Kennedy and Khrushchev, assorted high-level aides and political figures, and we certainly have at least some sense of the strengths and foibles of those 2 principal leaders. We also know how the crisis played out, so why now turn to a novel and read about it in fictional form? And I would have to say that it's a great thing to do because Professor Carter brings us so much closer to appreciating the real characters and events and to understanding the tensions of a nearly catastrophic episode in American and world history. And he does this by weaving together the real and the imagined with wonderful literary craftsmanship. But most of all, and this is really the most important thing, you can just be assured that the book is fun, engaging, and entertaining to read. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen L. Carter to Politics and Prose.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be back at Politics and Prose. It's great to be back in Washington, D.C. It's great to be back in my old neighborhood. Some of you know that back many, many years ago, when some people here weren't born, I lived down on Macomb Street for 3 years, and I went to Alice Deal Junior High School, as it was then known, right up the street. In fact, I just came from Alice Deal Junior High School because I was up here early. I thought I'd take a drive up there and take a look at the old place. I saw they've changed the name to Alice Deal Middle School. I never approve of name changes like that. It's like the way that libraries become information centers and things like that. But the good thing is, wonderful bookstores are still wonderful bookstores. And before I start, I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening, not only because it's a pleasant August evening, there are things you could be doing, but because whatever author is speaking, I think it's always a tribute to books themselves when people come out to listen to authors. I'm a great believer in books. In fact, you can find floating around YouTube somewhere a lecture that I gave to the Alumni Association a few years ago about why physical books are important to democracy. You may find that a little odd, and maybe it is a little odd. I'm an odd fellow, but I think I make a pretty good argument. In any case, certainly a provocative one, and so I commend you. I commend that to you. In any event, I'm here to talk tonight about my book, Back Channel. I'm not actually going to read from it. I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to talk about it from 2 different perspectives. Let me start by situating us in the history, because it's easy to forget, and I find it's very hard. I teach a course at Yale on the ethics of war, and we do a unit on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I find it's very difficult sometimes to get young people to understand how close the United States and the Soviet Union and possibly the world came to annihilation at the time of the crisis. That had some decisions been made differently, had certain things gone in a direction other than where they actually went, there could quite easily have been a nuclear war. It was the only existential crisis of that sort the world has ever faced since human beings began fighting wars, however many thousands of years ago that was. So it's a signal moment in the history of the world, and one that I think is underappreciated and understudied. What's underappreciated is the difficulty of crafting a solution. To understand how the problem arises, how the novel arises, let's start with some real history. 1960, John Kennedy is running for president against Richard Nixon. Kennedy is running in the tradition of post-World War II liberalism. It is a big government tradition that is big government both domestically and abroad. Kennedy accuses Eisenhower of cutting the defense budget too deeply. He says there's a missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that if he's elected, that he will restore the military balance and indeed surpass the Soviet Union in military might. Now, as it happens, there was no missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was far ahead of the Soviet Union in every military and technological category. Historians differ on whether Kennedy knew that or not. That's not really the point of the story. The point of the story is that he was elected in part on a platform that said he would do exactly that. We have every reason to believe from the existing sources, including the Soviet sources that are now open, that the Russians took him at his word. That is to say that they believed that he intended to rebuild the U.S. military and to gain a position of dominance over the Soviet Union. Shortly after Kennedy came into office, he inherited, if you will, the Bay of Pigs operation, in which you'll remember the Central Intelligence Agency had trained Cuban exiles for a mission to try to overthrow Castro, a mission that would have been almost comic in its failure had it not resulted in such great loss of life. When it became clear the invasion was going to fail, Kennedy decided not to send in air support, which was one of the contingency plans that had been adopted for the invasion. Now, the reason this matters is that Kennedy, although he always blamed Eisenhower, his sense was this was an Eisenhower program he had inherited, that nevertheless there was always a sense that Castro had won at the Bay of Pigs. And of course we know from the documents that the Kennedy administration spent the next year thinking of various ways to get Castro out of office. Castro, quite sensitive to this, was naturally very receptive when his partners in the Soviet Union came up with the idea of shipping missiles into Cuba. Now, what's interesting about the decision to ship missiles into Cuba is how the Soviet Union successfully kept this secret. The missiles began to come into Cuba, and we're talking about intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could have reached easily Washington, D.C. or New York City in a matter of minutes, carrying nuclear warheads. The missiles began to come in sometime in the early summer. All that was known in Washington was that something was being unloaded in big, well-guarded crates at various ports, particularly Mariel, in Cuba. But no one knew what it was. And all throughout the summer, the Kennedy administration was screaming for intelligence as to what was being shipped. All right, that part so far is history. Now let's talk about where my story diverges and begins to add a layer of fiction, and I hope fun as well. Two facts. Fact one, after the missiles were discovered, that is, after the United States discovered there were missiles in Cuba, as I assume most people here know, negotiations were held between the Kennedy administration and Nikita Khrushchev, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, there were secret negotiations that were being held, but there were also secret negotiations. That is to say, there was the secret negotiation that no one was supposed to know about, but everybody knew about. And then there was the secret negotiation, which nobody was supposed to know about, which nobody knew about. The secret negotiation, only a few people in the White House knew about. That was the so-called back channel. The back channel ran from President Kennedy and his national security advisor through Bobby Kennedy to John Scali of ABC News, who met with a man named Alexander Fomin, which was the cover name of the head KGB agent in Washington, at the Walgreens drugstore that used to be the Yenching Palace. That is, he met there when it was the Yenching Palace a number of times. And that was the secret back channel negotiation that was behind the other secret negotiation. So that's one historical fact. Here's the other historical fact. So about 10 years ago, 9 years ago maybe, Robert Dallek published his excellent biography of Kennedy, An Unfinished Life. And it was there that it was disclosed for the first time that while Kennedy was in the White House, he had an 18-month affair with a 19-year-old college student, an affair that overlapped the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a lot of facts about the affair have come out since then. No one doubts that it actually occurred. So my fictional premise runs as follows. Suppose there was no affair with a 19-year-old. Suppose the affair with the 19-year-old was a cover for the secret negotiations. And the person who was carrying messages to Alexander Fomin of the Soviet embassy was not John Scali of ABC News, but a 19-year-old college student named Margo Jensen who was pretending to have an affair with President Kennedy. Why the pretense? Because if people discovered their secret meetings, they would think they'd discovered an affair and therefore wouldn't look any more deeply. That's my fictional premise. So my novel, I like to think it's a thriller or a fun read, as you said, is crafted around that. You throw in a couple of car chases and, a few threats to Margo Jensen's life. That's her name, Margo Jensen. Then you've got a novel. My idea is that when the story begins, Margo Jensen is a 19-year-old sophomore at Cornell University, majoring in government, which is what the major they have there instead of political science, being mentored by one of the early conflict theorists and an invented character named Lawrence Niemeyer. And she has no higher goal in mind than going to law school. That's basically what she wants to do. She's a young African-American woman who was raised by a very stern grandmother after her father died in World War II and her mother died of cancer a few years later. And the very stern grandmother has trained her to be the kind of person whose only role in life is to impress the other kids with how smart she is and go as far as she can. And she has no other goal in life, but through a series of events ends up being drawn into these negotiations, indeed ends up being, for a variety of story-related reasons that I don't want to give away, the only person who would be trusted by the particular Soviet agent she's meeting with, Alexander Fomin, to carry out these back-channel negotiations. More than that about how it comes about, I don't want to say. Like most of my fiction, the novel involves an ordinary person drawn into an extraordinary set of circumstances. I very rarely, if ever, I'm not so interested in writing, even though my work, most of my novels are thrillers, I don't write about super spies or things like that. I'm interested in ordinary people and ordinary lives, people suddenly caught up in extraordinary circumstances. If you read my novel, The Impeachment of Abraham Lincoln, a couple of years ago, that was what you saw. If you read my novel, Jericho's Fall or The Emperor of Ocean Park, again, that was what you saw. You saw ordinary people being caught up in extraordinary circumstances. That to me is what's interesting about fiction generally. Now, I want to tell you a couple more things about the novel itself to whet your appetite for the Q&A session. And then I'm going to also answer a couple of the more commonly asked questions. Then I'm going to stop and listen to what you have to say. So in crafting the story, I had a couple of difficulties. I didn't want to tell the entire story from Margo's point of view. To make the story work as a thriller about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's important also that some of it be told from the point of view of Kennedy's inner circle. That is, there has to be somebody in the room when these difficult decisions that might or might not lead to war are being made. And after trying a number of different characters, real characters, I hit upon McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, as the character through whose eyes the inner part of the story would be told. How I hit upon Bundy, it was a combination of the availability of sources and not wanting to use someone who was so famous, like, say, Bobby Kennedy, that the comparisons with the real record would be constant and distracting, I thought, for the reader. In addition, Bundy, at least in the eyes of his contemporaries, had an air of mystery that was appropriate to the role, even though he was also seen by many people as cold and distant. He was described by someone as an IBM computing machine for whom the lives of individuals just factors in an equation, and I certainly try to bring across that aspect of his personality as well. So parts of the story are told from the point of view of Margo, most of it. Part of it is told from the point of view of Bundy, and then there are a couple of other points of view in the story as well. The other thing is that the first part of the story takes place very heavily in Bulgaria. Now, why on earth Bulgaria? Well, part of the story about Bulgaria is it has to do with the particular events I told you that I'm not going to describe that lead to Margo being the only person who can play this role, except for one. I will tell you one thing, though. The other reason it's Bulgaria is that there was another coincidence that as it happens, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place at the same time as the 1962 chess Olympiad in Varna, Bulgaria, which featured a very famous chess game between world champion Botvinnik and Bobby Fischer, who at that time was 19 years old and already showing signs of being completely nuts, although brilliant. Now, I'd always wanted to have Bobby Fischer in a novel, and this coincidence was too much to avoid. He had to be in the story once I discovered that. And where was he at the time? He was in Bulgaria. Therefore, Margo had to be in Bulgaria, but I found good ways to get her there. I think it works out rather well. Now, if you've read others of my novels, you know that with the exception of the Lincoln novel, although even there it's true, but no one was ever able to figure out who it was, each of my novels has at least one character from other novels who shows up in the pages. And people who read the Lincoln novel are still asking me, well, who is the character? That took place 150 years ago. So if you read it carefully and read the novels carefully, you will find an overlapping character. There really is one, but that's all right. I'm not going to tell you who that is. This novel has a number of characters from some of my other novels. In particular, if you read my first novel, The Emperor of Ocean Park, you would remember that the hero, I shouldn't say hero, certainly the protagonist, Misha Garland, from whose point of view the story is told, is married to a woman named Kimberly Madison, whose father is a very stern, retired Marine Corps colonel. In this novel, we also meet Kimberly Madison, except she's 2 years old, and her father is a very stern Marine Corps major, who actually plays an important role in the second half of the novel. There are other characters as well. There is a minor but important character from my novel Palace Council named Victoria Eldon, for example, who's in this novel as well. But I won't go into all those details. The main point is that to go back to the beginning, I crafted a thriller about the Cuban Missile Crisis in large part because I'm fascinated by the crisis itself. I'm fascinated by, in a sense, our inattention to it, our ability to put it behind us when a different set of decisions had been made. If Kennedy had not been able to steer the middle course between his doves who wanted to live with the missiles in Cuba and his hawks who wanted to go to war immediately to take them out, had he not been able to find a middle course and stick to it in the face of enormous pressure, we might have faced, as I said, nuclear war. And part of the novel is to bring that home. And indeed, some of the description of other things that are going on in the country as people begin to learn about the missiles, some of them from my memory, but also some of them from research as well, is an effort to bring all of that home. Nevertheless, in the end, it's not meant to be a teaching tool. It's not meant to be a work of history, although I like to think I got most history right. It's meant to be a fun book to read. Now, I'm going to answer two of the questions I've gotten most commonly while I've been touring about the book or in interviews, and then I'm going to stop and take questions that you have, which I assume you'll go to the microphones to ask. So two of the most common questions The first, perhaps the most common question of all that I've gotten about this, it comes about in several different forms, goes something like this. Could Kennedy really have kept secret an affair with a 19-year-old that lasted in real life that lasted in the story for a few weeks? And my answer is, in real life, it lasted for a year and a half. And he did successfully keep it secret, since it wasn't discovered until Dalek wrote his biography. It's interesting. Then after he wrote the biography of Kennedy, then the woman with whom he had the affair wrote her own book about it as well, and it's come up a lot since then. So the answer is, I think it could have been kept secret. But my point was to have the plan be that if the secret did get out, it would be the wrong secret. That is, there would be a risk to Kennedy's reputation, but people would stop there. They wouldn't think to look beneath that, to think there could be anything else going on. But the second question I've gotten a lot has to do with the likelihood that a 19-year-old black student in 1962 could A, be a successful student at an Ivy League university, or B, have the kind of background that this student has. Her grandmother, we're told in the story, went to Smith College back in the 1910s and so on, and a lot of people have asked about and she was from a well-to-do family, although not a rich family, but certainly a solidly middle-class family. She has the aspiration to go to law school and so on. And the answer, of course, is that although the country's racial history is what it is, and although our history of oppression is what it is, there have always been people over the last couple of centuries and families who've succeeded against these odds. And so I stuck one of them in the book, as I have in a couple of my earlier books. And since my own grandmother went to Smith back in the 1920s, I figure putting another black woman at Smith in the 19-teens isn't really that big a stretch. And I figured, since my own father went to Dartmouth in the 1940s, then why couldn't a 19-year-old go on to Cornell in the 1960s? That doesn't seem unreasonable at all, but I still find a lot of people are surprised. I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean that they are thinking, oh, that couldn't be true. They just think, I hadn't really thought about that, is a response that I still get a lot. But again, I'm not trying to teach anything about that. I'm simply trying to write a book that's fun to read, that'll keep you turning the pages, and I hope that this one will do that. And as to whether I'm going to do more, as long as people keep buying them, then publishers will keep paying me to write them. And as long as I'm paid to write them, I'll keep writing them. If the time comes when I come to Politics and Prose and 3 people are here, then I'll know it's time to stop writing fiction. It's time to get a real job or something like that. Let me stop there and take questions that you might have. I would only ask, since there's a lot of people here, that you keep your questions as short as possible, and I will make my answers as long as possible.
So what do you think? I've heard an apocryphal story that on the plane back to Washington on November 22nd, 1963, one Lyndon Baines Johnson was overheard to say, well, Castro got Kennedy before Kennedy got Castro. Is that real history, you think, or alternative history? And when and if the Castro brothers ever die, do you think we'll get the story from the horse's mouth, so to speak?
I do not pretend to be an expert on the Kennedy assassination. I've read a number of books about it over the years, but I'm not an expert on it. It's funny you say that. Dallas had a commemoration for the 50th anniversary last year, and I was down there to serve on a panel and also to give a talk. They had a number of panels about a number of different subjects. So what's interesting about it is that the panel that I was on had nothing to do with whether Castro was behind it, or the mafia was behind it, or Lyndon Johnson was behind it, the oilmen were behind it, the CIA was behind it. That was not the subject of the panel, but it was the subject of almost every question. That's what people wanted to talk about, but I don't have a strong view on that. I know there are people who do have strong views. I will say this: there are some there are places in the book where, for people who do think there was a conspiracy of some kind, I planted little clues in the book that they could like. But if you don't think there was any kind of conspiracy, the clues will go right by you, which is fine. I wanted to please readers of every kind. Let me put it that way. Other questions?
I wanted to follow up on your description of Margo. Okay, she's 19. She's a sophomore at Cornell, but she's African American. How does she get away with a secret affair that's not an affair, and she's a spy, and she's
not a spy,
and
but
she's
yeah.
a negotiator, and she's meeting in secret? I mean, how does she get away with this?
Well, that's an excellent question, but I can't give you the answer because it's in the book. I mean, you wouldn't have to read the second half of the book if I answered that. Let me say this. I honestly think that the devices that I use to let her get away with it, I believe they work. You might disagree, but I hope you'll read it and see if I think the devices I use in the book actually do work. I will say one thing about it, which is that I had the same question, a version of it, when I wrote my book about Lincoln, which featured largely from the point of view of a 21-year-old black woman. I got a lot of questions actually from journalists on tour about could a 21-year-old woman have moved in these various circles in Washington, a 20-year-old black woman? And the answer is there were people who did. I mean, that's the only answer I can give you. I'm not claiming there were a lot of people who did, but there were people who did. And all I really need is one person who did. And I should have mentioned, by the way, remember I said that her father died in the war? Margaret's father died in the war. That's also something that becomes a mystery as the book goes on, is how her father died in the war, which ends up being tied into a lot of what else is going on. There's a question of what actually happened to Margot's father. It turns out to be a relevant question in the story. So, who else has one?
Hi, Steve. George Keyes.
I remember you well. I'm glad you remember me too.
Yeah.
We were in law school together, and there's some other law school friends here also, over there, and I thought I saw someone else, but I may have been wrong.
This question goes to the craft of constructing a novel.
And I appreciate that you think it's craft. Reviewers don't always think that about my
Well,
work, but that's...
I understand. Well, I think it's craft because I can't do it, so I know it takes an extraordinary amount of skill, and certainly to keep my attention. And your books have, successively, with increasing interest. And I want to just ask you, you tell your stories many times through women. And I find the characterizations are getting richer each book. And I wonder how you think of that. Is that something that you are conscious of trying to do? Or is that just my subjective appreciation? And the second thing is a sense of place. In the Impeachment of Abraham Lincoln, I got an extraordinary look at Washington, D.C. as it might have been 150 years ago. And I found it incredible. How did you do it, and why did you do it?
Well, those are good questions. As to the first question, I get asked different versions of that question, and they're not always as polite as the way that you put it. I did a book signing for Lincoln in the Hamptons last year, and there was a question that I would describe as, how dare you tell your story through the eyes of a woman, is the way that I would put the question. I don't usually, well, let me go back a step. Almost every novel I've written, which is say every novel except this one, my first 5 novels had in common that I had characters or stories I wanted to tell before I had the story. That is, in each of my first 5 novels, I had people who were in my head who I couldn't get out. If you've read Kurt Vonnegut's novel, The Breakfast of Champions, you know what I'm talking about. There were people in my head who needed to get out, and I had to write stories to get them out of my head. And some of them are men, some of them are women. It just turned out a certain way. I can't say that I sat and say, I think I'll write stories, more of them through the point of view of women. These are the characters who came to me. If the characterization is getting better, I'm glad to hear that. I'd like to believe I've gotten better at this as I've gone along. In fact, I said to an interviewer in Atlanta the other day that this was the first of my 6 novels that made me feel like a novelist. That is, up until this point, I've always described myself in interviews and even in talks like this one as a law professor who also writes novels. But this one actually, the reason I reacted to the use of the word craft is I actually felt it was, when I felt I was crafting it. I was crafting a novel. And I think there's a reason for the difference. I mentioned that in my first 5 novels, I always had the characters, and then I had the story. This is the first time I had the story before I had the characters, because ever since I read Dalek's book, which I did when it came out, and thought about the affair with the 19-year-old that overlapped the Cuban Missile Crisis, this story has been tickling at the back of my mind. Not a character story I wanted to tell, but the notion, what if it wasn't really an affair? What if it had to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis? That as a fictional premise was tickling the back of my mind from that time. So this is the first time I've started with the story and then had to come up with the characters to fit it. That was a very different process of writing a novel than I've ever used before. And it was an adventure, but actually it was in certain ways easier. I don't mean that writing novels is ever easy for me, it's agony. That's why I can't write a novel every year. For years, my publisher always says, if you wrote a novel every year, we could pay you more money, and I can't. Whatever it is that you need to do that, I cannot do it. I know I've mentioned the story from this very lectern before, but years ago, I went to a talk that was being given by a woman who was one of these best-selling novelists, and she turned to these novels every year, year after year after year, bang, bang, bang. And I was late, and it was in a big auditorium. There were hundreds of people there. I was sitting all the way in the back, and she's talking about her writing process and the outline and so on. And so I'm in the question queue. I'm the very last question of the night. And I asked her, I said, I have a question. I said, I noticed you said you write from an outline. I said, do you ever find that when you write from the outline, the characters come alive for you and they take over the story and they won't do in chapter 4 what you wanted them to do in chapter 1 and so on and so on? And she said, no. And that's why she was able to write a story every year, I think, that she had that full command of the material at all times. I think this is the best command I've had of it, but I don't feel anything like having full command. As to the second part about the city, I'm glad you made that point about the Lincoln novel. The Lincoln novel, I really wanted the city to be virtually a character in the story. I did a lot of research about Washington of the 1860s to try to bring alive the sights of the city. So in that novel, when Abigail Canner, my protagonist, is standing on her front porch, I wanted the view to be plausibly what she'd actually have seen from that front porch on that block of that street at that time. The sights of the city, the sounds of the city, even the smells of the city. I did a lot of research about that. This book, similarly, it was a little easier because it's the 1960s instead of the 1860s, but I didn't want to make the mistake of relying on my own memories. I was a kid in Washington at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I turned 8 on the Friday before the U-2 was shot down. Then I turned 8 on Friday, it was shot down on Saturday. And so I was a little kid. I didn't want my memories to be the basis of Washington. So I went through the same process, which involves largely what I've looked at least for this, are maps, photographs, newspaper stories not about the events, but about various things going on in the city and so on. And then for the Lincoln novel, I also relied very heavily on diaries and correspondence that have been published. I didn't do that so much for this one. I relied much more on just the maps and the various histories about Washington, of which there are, of course, a lot, and what the city was like, to get a sense of what the city was like at the time. But I find when I write historical fiction that that's really quite important. My first real venture into historical fiction was my novel Palace Council, which spans from the 50s to the 70s. And for that, I had to get a sense of what Harlem was like in the 50s. And in addition to the research, there I actually did 2 interviews, in addition to the research and visiting a couple of museums and talking to the staff there, and so on. I do think it's an obligation of every novelist to try to get as many facts right that are outside the fiction as possible. But for the historical novelist in particular, I think it's a serious obligation to try to make sure that the factual claims that I make that aren't story related, because I might make traffic one way instead of the other way because it's important to the narrative, but short of that, if I'm going to say where a firehouse is, it ought to really have been there in 1962, that sort of thing. I'm sure I get it wrong sometimes. In fact, I know I get it wrong. Since you mentioned the Lincoln novel, I'll just tell you the one more story, which is when I did the Lincoln novel, I did a signing in Springfield, Illinois. And if there's any here from Springfield, but the thing about Springfield, Illinois is there's only, 60 or 70,000 people, but everyone's a man, one child's a Lincoln expert. They all know everything about Lincoln. And so I did a signing at the Lincoln Library. It's a big audience, and all these questions, and virtually every question began something like this. Well, actually, that was how they began. In fact, I remember the very first question. I noticed that early in the book you refer to Lake Springfield. Your book is set in 1867. Do you realize Lake Springfield didn't get its name until 1871? That kind of thing, And, I should have been aware. Okay, you got me. The funny thing about that question is then someone came up later during the when I was signing and said, I was going to ask Lake Springfield a question, but the other woman got to it first. He said. So not only the Lincoln experts, they're very competitive Lincoln experts. So far, I've gotten only one question about something I got wrong about Washington, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember what it was. I was in St. Louis last week, and someone said there was something I gotten wrong about the geography of Washington in 1962, and I cannot for the life of me remember what it was now. Someone had lived here at the time, but I'm embarrassed to say. It's in my notebook. I wrote it down, but I can't. These things slide. I can't remember what it was. So, any corrections about what I said about Washington? Gleefully accepted. Well, gratefully, not gleefully. Are there other? Oh, yes.
Hi. Thanks for coming tonight. So you teach at Yale and you write books and you travel and talk about them. What's your secret for organizing all that stuff in your life?
What's my secret for organizing all that? I don't know where you got the idea that I'm organized. That's the thing. If I were organized, I could probably be more productive, has always been my thought about this. My wife would say that the secret to having the productivity I do is sacrificing sleep. If you don't sleep, you can get a lot more done. I don't know if that's it exactly. It's that, I once did an interview with Richard Posner, who is a very prolific federal judge. By most counts, for most of his career, he's written more opinions per year than any other federal judge. He also tends to write at least 1, 2, and a few years ago, he had 3 books that came out in 1 year. And he also writes law review articles, gives endowed lectures, and so on. And there was an interview in which he was asked, how do you do this? And he said, I don't understand the question. He said, writing is what I do. It's my hobby. It's when I have nothing to do, I write something, he said. Now, that's kind of how I feel. And now I write something. Unfortunately, I'm not well organized enough to turn it out maybe as fast as I should. I mean that, I'm not being facetious. I mean that seriously. But I do feel, from the time I was very young, I've always enjoyed putting words together. Fiction, nonfiction, a law review article, an op-ed, a short story, a novel, a nonfiction book. That's not the issue of what I'm writing. It's putting words on a page. It's the only skill I really have. And I've been blessed enough to be able to make money from that skill. But that's my only skill. I can put words together on a page, and I really can't do much else. And I spend a lot of time putting them together. And there are times when I don't know what I'm writing until I'm almost done. I'm not sure where something is going. For some time. At any moment on my laptop, I have so many unfinished projects that I have no idea where they're going. But there's no secret. It's just a matter of doing the writing. And it's funny, a lot of times at a book signing, like any author, people come up to me and they'll say, I think I have a novel in me. People say, how do I find time to write it? And I say what I say to almost everyone. I think if you think you have a novel in you, you almost certainly have a novel in you. I think it's probably true. But the way you write it, the only way you write it is for it to be a job. It's hard to be a job when it's your own boss, but it has to be a job like anything else. And so the way I try to conceptualize it, like when I'm talking to audiences, say at a writer's conference, is this. Suppose that you are a vascular surgeon, and your best friend calls up one afternoon and says, let's go out tonight and do whatever thing is you most enjoy doing with your best friend. And if you're a vascular surgeon, you say, I can't, because I've got to go scrub in for surgery at 5:30 tomorrow morning. Friend says, I understand. Now suppose you're not a vascular surgeon. Suppose you're a school teacher. And you say, I can't, because I've got 31 student compositions I've got to read down tomorrow. Your friend understands. Suppose you're a bus driver and you say, I can't because I'm doing a double shift today so I can take off next week when my in-laws are in town. Your friend understands. But if you say, I can't because I have to write, I say, what? And people are offended. And I went through years of people being offended before they realized I was actually serious about it. But that's what it takes. It's that. The commitment is to think of it as a job, but the problem is you're the boss, and you have to be willing to conceptualize it that way. My boss has told me to work late tonight. If you can't do that, you can't finish. If you can do that, if you're willing to risk the ridicule of your friends, and maybe losing some friends who think you're just coming up with an excuse, then you can finish. If you're not willing to do that, then you can't. It's not that there are some people who have talent and do all this writing, some people don't. It's that I think a lot of people could write if they're willing to treat it as a job alongside the other job, but that's a big sacrifice. And it's a sacrifice that not everyone, I think, wants to make, and not everyone should make. Because if everybody made that sacrifice, nobody would have any friends. Nobody would ever go out and do anything fun, and that wouldn't be cool either. Well, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about this. There's too much competition. That's right. That would be the other problem. Any more questions?
I've read many of your fiction books, and
I
one
appreciate
thing
that.
that I really like about your style is that the continuity of characters in your subsequent novels. So my question to you, actually I've got two questions. The first question is, do you know ahead of time which character you're going to carry forward? Or as you're writing it, does it suddenly come on you that this is somebody that you want to continue this story? And then my second question is that you mentioned a few minutes ago that you're not a prolific author in the sense that every year you've got to write a new novel, but you also said you've got a lot of stories in you to tell. Now that you've finished Back Channel, do you have an idea of what your next story is going to be?
Okay, as to those are great questions. As to the first question, until this novel, I would have always answered yes. I know which characters from my last novel are going to be the next one. This one I didn't. This one, precisely because of the way I constructed it, I had a story first, and then I had to find people to put in it. I kind of hunted around for people to play various roles, and occasionally I would say, oh, that role could be so-and-so from this other novel. So this was the only one where I didn't know. And the other ones I always knew where the continuity was going to be, which characters were going to show up. And by the way, when I was mentioning the characters in these novels, I forgot to mention, if you read my novel Jericho's Fall, Jericho Ainsley shows up in this novel as a very young CIA agent. And also, I should have mentioned from The Emperor of Ocean Park, also Jack Ziegler from The Emperor of Ocean Park. If you remember the villain, you might think of him as the story, is also a very young fellow in this novel as well. As to the second question, do I know what I'm writing next? Well, yes and no. That is, I've been talking to my editor and my agent about a number of different ideas, several of my half-finished ideas. And it's possible, I'm trying to think of how to put this in terms of the way we discuss this thematically in these conversations we've been having. So it is possible that my next novel will be quite similar to what you've seen in my novels generally. But it is also possible that it'll be very, very different, that it will be hardly recognizable as the kind of thing I've written. So it won't be a slight divergence. It'll either be a lot like what you've come to expect, another historical novel with many of the same characters, although I'm still getting closer and closer to the present day in history. In fact, the one I currently have on the board, which would be the most likely one if we go that way, begins in It stems from 1976 to roughly the present day. And it's largely about a particular family. There's also, it involves a couple of presidential campaigns and some other things that happen. So that's one possibility, but there are some other possibilities that are, and that one is, of all the projects on my laptop, that is by far the one that is closest to being finished. It's probably the only one that if I finished it, we could probably publish even next year. But the other ones, which are very, very different, some of which are near and dear to my heart, it's possible that one of the other ones might come out instead. That's all. It depends on these various conversations, and it depends on, there's financial factors involved too. There's the question of, I mean, part of it is what I want and part of it is what my publisher wants, and so we're going to work out something between us. They'll basically, it's not that they'll get to choose one, I'll get to decide which one, but it depends on, but those conversations we're still involved in. So, and of course, I also have to do my other work. I've got nonfiction books to write as well, and there's kind of a backlog of those. There's a couple of publishers wanting to know what happened to the book, and so, there's that problem too. One has to deal with. Oh. Anybody else? I suspect this one is supposed to. We have time for one more question. Is that right? Okay. A couple more. Okay.
Thank you for coming.
It is a pleasure.
I guess my question is more about, since it is a historical fiction, have you had families or people come up to you and say that, you touched a little too close to home, this is like my family, or this could be a person from my history, and you've, caricatured them correctly or incorrectly? And then a second question would
I have
be,
not had that with this novel.
Okay.
I have had that with two of my novels. With The Emperor of Ocean Park, I was sitting at this table or its predecessor, and a very nice woman came up to me, and she had a copy of the book for me to sign, and this is 12 years ago, and she leaned over to me and she said, "I don't mind that you stole my family's story, but that's not the way my father was at all." So she said. So you run into that sometimes. I didn't know who she was, I admit, and I'm sorry if I stole the family story. I ran into that a little bit with Palace Council, but that wasn't so much people disputing, that wasn't arguing about their families. There were a couple of people who knew or said they knew some of the historical characters in the novel and said they weren't like that at all. They were different in one way or another. And that may be true. People have many sides. I construct the best I can from the history. But as far as I know, I haven't really deeply offended anybody. I'd like to think. It's not that novels should be utterly inoffensive. If you're going to write seriously, you're bound to offend people. It's not that. But I don't want to do it unnecessarily, and so I hope that I haven't. I will tell you one thing, though. So my first novel, The Emperor of Ocean Park, if you read it, you might remember there was a woman named Dana Worth who was a lesbian. That's relevant to the story that I'm about to tell you. So after the novel comes out, I get in the mail a copy of the book, The Emperor of Ocean Park. Will you please sign this novel to my straight son, Dana Worth, who is currently an undergraduate at Yale, where you teach.
Oh, no.
So I do remember that one. But I think she took it all. The woman who wrote the letter seemed to take it all in good stead. But no, so I haven't had that particular experience. My main experience is being corrected by experts about things that I got wrong.
And then a small follow-up, I guess. Has anyone talked to you about possibly doing any films about?
Has anyone talked to me about possibly doing films? Oh, people talk about it all the time. The question is, will they put money on the table? We had a lot of conversations about a lot of novels. The lay of the land is this. In all the years, we've only sold the movie rights to one novel. We turned down 2 offers for 2 other novels because they just weren't, in our judgment, serious money. And we've had conversations. We thought we had a really, really good deal for Palace Council, a really great deal, but as so many things in Hollywood, it came apart. And after that deal happened to come apart, I ran into the director. When I say the director, not related to any of the things I've done. Douglas Lyman at a party on Martha's Vineyard, and we were chatting about that, and he says, "Oh, nobody buys novels anymore." He said, "You're not even a young adult, are you?" He said, and other than that, he said, "Nobody buys novels anymore." It's not entirely true, but it is the case that sellings that are not pre-sold, as they say, to Hollywood has gotten much harder than it used to be. So I don't write them thinking about the various ancillary rights. I just write them hoping to sell books, and as the rest, we'll see what, if anything, ever happens.
Well, I'm glad you are still doing that.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out tonight as well.